So we've heard a variety of different perspectives already this morning, and now we're going to go deep on one particular topic, which we already heard come up multiple times this morning, and that's cybersecurity. So I'm very excited to be joined here by Dr. Greer, who has had a variety of roles in the federal government, both at the National Institute of Standards and Technology as well as other agencies. He is currently NIST Executive Director for the Smart Grid and Cyber Physical Systems Program Office, and he's the National Coordinator for Smart Grid Interoperability. He also previously has served as the Assistant Director for Information Technology R&D in the White House Office of Science and Technology, and as a cybersecurity liaison to the National Security Staff. And if you are talking with Dr. Greer and sort of get tired talking about cybersecurity things, I find it fascinating, actually, in his background, learning about him, talk to him about gene splicing, right? He, early in his life, was on the faculty at the University of California, Irvine, where his research focused on gene expression. So I'm curious to hear one day how you transitioned from that to this. But fascinating background. So we've been having fun this morning with the digital polling tool, but I'm going to go back and do now an analog polling tool, right? I'm hearing more and more as we talk about physical and cybersecurity issues, do we need to go back to analog processes? So let's do an analog poll. So on a scale of 1 to 10, how many people feel like on the topic of cybersecurity knowledge, you're sort of at the top, you're sort of like 7 or above in terms of your knowledge on cybersecurity issues? Okay, all right.
Some of the NIST people should raise their hands.
Yeah, if you work for Hamm, raise your hand really high. How many people sort of feel like you're in the mid-range, 5 to 7, okay? And how many people admit, like, I really know nothing about cybersecurity? Yeah, I'm putting my hand up. So the fact that I'm sitting here is fascinating to me. You never would have convinced me just a couple of years ago that I'd be up here leading a conversation about cybersecurity. So again, just goes to show how fast things change in our industry. So let's go ahead and get started. I have a few questions I'm going to ask Chris, but we are going to save a lot of this time for questions and dialogue with you. So, within 10 minutes or so, 10 to 15 minutes, we're going to very quickly turn to you guys. So as you know, there are 2 standing mics in the aisles. So please be thinking about what questions or comments you might want to share as part of this conversation. So let's just start, for those who are not familiar with NIST. Tell us a little bit about NIST and what is the role that it plays in the electric power sector?
Okay. Well, NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, that's our name since 1975. We used to be called the National Bureau of Standards. And that bureau was formed in the early 1900s, 1901. And it was formed to execute the responsibility provided in the Constitution of the United States that the government should manage or fix the measures of weights and standards. And so we execute that responsibility at NIST. We're a bureau in the Department of Commerce, right? So that means that our real role is to use these measurement capabilities to promote innovation and to create platforms for entrepreneurship and promote economic growth, new jobs, all of the roles of the Department of Commerce. But we do that through science and engineering, measurement science and engineering. And so if you come up to the NIST campus, which is located up in Gaithersburg, beautiful campus, you'll find lots of scientists and engineers, graduate students, visiting faculty members, and very nice research capability and facilities, test beds, and so on. So we're a research organization, and the shorthand that some people use is the National Laboratory for Commerce, right, for industry. And so an awful lot of the work we do, of course, is directly in interaction with industry as well. In the smart grid arena, the Energy Independence and Security Act of 2007 assigned to the NIST director the responsibility to coordinate the development of a framework for smart grid interoperability. So there are really 3 key words in there: coordinate. So Congress didn't say NIST shall develop and go back in our labs and do the work. They said coordinate. And so all of our work is done in very close coordination with all of you across the grid sector and all of your perspectives. The second was this idea of framework, right? And so again, this wasn't about regulation or policy. It was about a framework of best practices and guidelines based on industry and their input that could be used on a voluntary basis, right? So we're not a regulatory agency. We don't regulate anybody. We're not a standards body. We actually don't issue standards. We support various standards organizations like ISO, like IEC, IEEE, and others through technical input and through the basic research that enables those bodies to do their work. But we don't issue the standards ourselves. And so that means that we're a fairly easy group to work with, right? We're not going to make you do anything. We don't issue standards. What we're going to do is work with you to provide the best technical foundations for getting things done.
Great, and we'll come back both to the framework and your coordination role a little more depth a little bit later. But so let's start talking big picture, sort of in terms of the cybersecurity threat to this industry. From your vantage point, how is that changing and evolving? How should we be thinking about that threat?
Yeah, probably the easiest way to answer the question is what's not changing as well. Almost everything in the landscape is changing in really significant ways. We've heard a lot already today in these sessions about the digitization of everything in every sector. So it's not unique to the grid sector by any means. Every sector of our society is experiencing this IT explosion and the emergence of the Internet of Things. And so all of these new technical advances come with remarkable capabilities, but also bring the occasional vulnerability as well. And so cybersecurity is really a necessary part of that landscape. Another important factor there is, as I said, cybersecurity is an issue in every sector. And so the grid sector, while there are important consequences, many of the basic threats and mitigation mechanisms are similar across lots of sectors. So an important basic message is that cybersecurity is a team sport. And by coordinating and cooperating, we can learn from what's being done in other sectors as well as help other sectors with their needs as well. Interoperability is a big part of our mission, and interoperability means connecting more things to one another, and those continuing connections can create vulnerabilities as well. And as more organizations connect to one another, there are a greater set of interdependencies between those organizations as well. New devices, new systems. On the threat side, the threats are evolving very quickly. I mean, early on in cybersecurity, we focused very heavily on problems of information exfiltration, losing your information as one of the important threats. That remains an important threat, but you're hearing much more about ransomware now these days. And also some of the newer threats, crash override being one of the more recent examples in the news, which are designed not for information exfiltration, but for controlling systems to create damage and downtime and such. That's a different approach and creates a new level of threat, particularly in the grid sector. So cybersecurity is not becoming less important over time. It's clearly becoming more important. The threats and their nature change, and the vulnerabilities change. So it's not a one-time fix it and you're done. It's always a continuing effort.
Right. So for the folks here in the audience, we've got a mix of DER, solution provider companies, utilities, regulators, a lot of different stakeholders from across the industry. What advice do you have for all of these people? How should they be thinking about cybersecurity and what they should be doing to ensure that as a community we're addressing all of the things we need to address? Yeah,
so an important additional principle in the cybersecurity space is no one size fits all. So there's not one answer to that question. Instead, it's really important that everybody recognize they have their respective roles. Each individual in an organization, each organization in a supply chain or an operations chain has their own role and responsibility. And it's clear, it's important that everyone in that chain of dependencies is clear on what their roles are and what steps they need to take. And that's where the NIST cybersecurity framework comes into play.
Okay.
That's really a structure to help people understand what are all of the roles that are out there, which ones should I be thinking about and am I responsible for? And for my partners, how can I ask them what they're doing in each of these spaces?
And so how do people access the framework? I assume they go on your website, they're going to find it easily, just Google it, and they're going to get their hands on it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So on the www.nist.gov/cyberframework, all one word,
okay,
you'll find it there. If you use your favorite search engine and just search for NIST framework, you'll find that page as well. It's pretty popular and gets a lot of visits. And so that's the place to find information there as well.
Okay, and so for the people that raise their hands to say, I'm in that low range, I know pretty much nothing about cybersecurity, is the framework, who's the framework designed for? Are those people who aren't really versed in cybersecurity? Is it a user-friendly thing for anyone, or is it really aimed at people who sort of have training and expertise in that area?
Yeah, it's intended for all of the above.
Okay.
And so the framework, the core of the framework is a set of 5 functions: identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover.
Okay.
Right? So those are the 5 things that you need to think about in any cybersecurity activity. And so for the people who are really just coming to this, understanding what those 5 are is really a good start, so that you know how to organize your activities, how to talk about them, how to understand what your partners are doing. For those who are more deeply involved in this, at the next level are a set of categories. And so within identify, a set of categories of activities that help you to identify what the vulnerabilities and threats are with respect to your particular risk management profile. Goes down to a level of subcategories that breaks down each of those categories. And for the really deep folks, there's a set of references for each of those subcategories where you can go read the standards, read the underlying work, and really get a deep dive on that. So with that structure of the framework, you can pick how far you want to go down into that. And if you just understand those 5 functions, you can talk with the cybersecurity experts pretty well.
Great. Well, that sounds like a hugely valuable exercise to have common language, so that no matter what your level of expertise is or experience, you're able to have that conversation, which also ties nicely into going back to the conversation about your role as coordinator. So talk to us more about NIST's role, the coordination mode specifically as it relates to cybersecurity. What are some of the specific things that you're currently focused on?
Yeah, great. As I said, our responsibility is to coordinate, and so we do this in a wide variety of ways. SEPA is one of the environments we use for that coordination, and the Smart Grid Cybersecurity Committee is an important mechanism there. In fact, there's a session on Friday at 1 o'clock. It will be led by Nelson Hastings and Suzanne Lightman from NIST. Nelson is back there in the back in a bright red shirt. Stand up, Nelson. See him on Friday.
He's got the red threat, the red threat color on. Yeah.
Perfect, Nelson. That committee is an open public working group. Right? Anybody can participate in that. It's a good place to meet people who are working hard on real solutions to cybersecurity, to share ideas and concepts, and to understand the emerging consensus across the industry on what are the best practices and approaches, and where are people going next, right? Given they're here, where are they going to be going next, and what's that group going to be doing in the next year? So I really encourage you to take part in that conversation as well. We coordinate actively with the Department of Energy, of course. The Department of Energy has, as you're all aware, a huge role in the smart grid sector. And so we work closely with them on programs like their Cybersecurity for Energy Distribution Systems, the SEDS program. We collaborate in our research efforts with the National Lab folks, and there are several here today. That provides, I think, an excellent opportunity to link what we're doing in measurement science to the real applications and the things that are being done at those national labs. We coordinate through a mechanism called the National Cybersecurity Center of Excellence, lovingly called NCCOE. Only NIST could love an acronym like that, but it's
I've heard worse.
It's what we got. This is a federally funded research and development organization. And so it's a collaboration hub where scientists, engineers, technologists, innovators from industry, from academia, and from government can get together, right, and work on practical demonstration solutions to a defined problem. And those demonstrations use real-world products. They use things that you can buy today, put them together into a demonstration solution that shows you how it works and is well documented. So you can see exactly what the functions were, how to understand what was required in each of the modules of the solution, and how measurements were made, so that you can do it all yourself as well.
If companies have an interest in getting involved in demonstrations like that with NIST, what's the process look like?
Absolutely. And we've just finished recently a demonstration with the smart grid sector on identity access and management and modules for doing that. It was very successful. Involved utilities, vendors, software developers, and others who came together to develop that solution. So again, if you use your favorite search engine and look for NCCOE, you will find that web page. And on that page is a link where you can submit ideas. You can see what all of the developing ideas are. So there's a process for suggesting ideas, for getting people to say, we like this one, we don't like that one, and deciding which ones industry is really anxious to work on and ready to dive into. And so you'll see some finished examples, some underway, and some ideas that are out there already.
Oh, that's great. So I am going to take audience questions. I don't see one up here yet, but please, if you have a question, make your way on up to the mic. So talk to us a little bit about what's next for the framework. As you said, things are changing rapidly, which I assume means that maybe things have to evolve with the framework as well. Where do you go with the framework from here? Yeah,
absolutely. So yes, things change rapidly, and the framework has to change with them. The original framework, version 1.0, was published in 2014. And so NIST is now in the middle of creating version 1.1 of the framework. So this is an evolution of the framework to respond to this changing landscape. This is a very coordinated process and really illustrates how we do business. The first draft revision was released in January by NIST for public comments. We received a very large amount of really useful input, lots and lots and lots of good comments. We held a workshop in April to go over those comments and to get feedback on what are good responses and ways of revising to address all of those comments. The technical report from that workshop was published on the NIST website just last week. Okay. So it's a week old. This is a chance to see what were the comments, what did the community think those comments meant, and how should things be revised. So we'll be taking that, producing another revision, which should come out in the fall, and with again, for public comments. And then we hope to publish that final version in the next fiscal year. And so you can see this is a very careful process to make sure we've got the framework right, we've got the right revisions, that it works for industry and the sector, and there's real consensus that this is a workable, usable framework. And what we don't want is a framework that doesn't work for folks.
Right, great. Okay, please introduce yourself and ask away.
So my name's Josh Wetman. I'm with Leidos Engineering. One of the reasons cybersecurity seems so daunting to so many people is it's an incredibly wide set of things with a lot of depth behind every single one of them. And I think that really makes a challenge for people to understand what success looks like in taking on such an endeavor, and people shy away from it. Do you have a way of describing to leaders or people who are accountable how to think about succeeding with such a big mission in order to see it as achievable instead of just too much?
Yeah, an excellent question, and that goes to probably what a lot of you are thinking about when you say, when Julie asked, how much do you know about cybersecurity? Well, it turns out there's a lot to know about cybersecurity, and when do you know that you know enough? This question came up as part of the revision process, and so one of the changes to the previous framework is to add an initial discussion on how entities, organizations in the sector could do self-assessment, exactly what you're talking about. Using the framework as the self-assessment structure. So what are you doing on identify and what are the kinds of indicators that your identify process is uncovering the right sets of things and so on. So it's not a measurement method per se, and it's not intended to be a way of auditing an organization. Rather, it's intended as a self-assessment tool for organizations to use to see where are we in this process, how well are we doing in each of these 5 functions, and what are the gaps that we might have. And so this is just another demonstration of the way in which the framework provides a way of prioritizing your investments, right? Identifying gaps in the overall cybersecurity effort, communicating with your partners about what your needs and expectations are for those, for example, who are in your supply chain, and being able to confirm that they're taking the steps that are necessary for you to ensure that your cybersecurity meets your needs. So those things are addressed in this initial revision, and we hope that everybody will, particularly those that you were talking about that are at the decision-making level, not cybersecurity experts, take a look at that revised section and see if you can imagine using that effectively in your organization to do such a self-assessment.
Great. Okay, we've got time for 2 more questions, so we'll go over here and then come back over to the side. Please go ahead.
Harold Gray, Commissioner from Delaware. From where do you see a sufficient workforce coming with the appropriate competencies to manage the Internet of Everything and cybersecurity around it?
Yeah, that's a terrific question. And this relates to the previous question that cybersecurity is both broad and deep and requires a broad range of expertise. And so some years ago, the White House asked NIST to lead an initiative called the National Initiative for Cybersecurity Education, or NICE. So it's a nice initiative, right? As opposed to NCCOE, which is a little hard to categorize. This is a government-wide effort. It involves the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Defense, Department of Energy, NIST, and others. And it's also a community-led activity, right? Very much in our coordination mode, involving educational institutions across the nation who are working to develop, for example, curricula for cybersecurity training and education, certification strategies, promotional strategies for letting people know about the educational opportunities in this space. And so that effort is very much underway. It's a challenging activity because this is a challenging specialty, but if we were to be successful as a nation in cybersecurity, that workforce is critical. As a side benefit, right? It creates a whole set of new jobs, new job opportunities, and so on. So again, if you look for National Initiative for Cybersecurity Education, you'll find the NICE website on our nice NIST web pages, as opposed to our not so nice web pages.
All right, final question.
David Hill with Vermont Energy Investment Corporation. This is kind of a macro level question of sometimes the Internet of Things by itself, the very name raises the threat of cybersecurity to people, and yet a more networked and distributed system sometimes is seen as more resilient. So do you see, on balance, the increasing distribution of interoperable devices and networked activities as being more resilient, or being something that, another approach is to kind of draw up the drawbridge and go back to more centralized systems as a means of attaining cybersecurity? So looking forward, do you see the more networked interoperability being the path that we're likely to be on for the long term?
Yeah, right. I think that genie's out of the bottle. So I don't think going backwards is feasible. That being said, there's some tendency to focus on the threat side of the equation, the new vulnerabilities that are created, the greater impact that occurs by connecting things in the physical world, and the more pervasive nature of this threat. That's on the threat side of the equation. All of those things are true. On the other side of the equation, the mitigation side of the equation, this business of Internet of Things and cyber physical systems actually expands the mitigation surface, the number of ways in which you can address threats and vulnerabilities. And this is important, especially important in the smart grid sector. And that's what I call, physics for better cybersecurity, right? Because we have developed a pretty good physical and engineering understanding of the grid and its behaviors, we can use that knowledge to create better cyber defenses. And so there are various groups that are researching this business of better cybersecurity through physics, through real applications. And there's a group of ABP and University of Illinois researchers who are looking at substation security using consensus state estimation with IEDs, and essentially evaluating the physical state of the system against the control signals that are being received, and making a consensus or voting decision about whether that control signal makes sense given the current state of the grid, or whether there's some indication of an attack. So this is a detect mechanism in the cyber framework, but it's a physics-based detect mechanism. So I think if we're smart, what we'll do is expand our mitigation strategies to include not just the digital mitigation strategies that we have been so focused on in current IT enterprise scale systems, and supplement that with physics and engineering mechanisms. We have literally for thousands of years been engineering safer, more secure systems through engineering. We need to continue that practice.
All right. Well, on that note, we are out of time. I do want to reiterate, if anyone is not already involved in the SEPA committee, which is part of NIST's great coordination function, is interested in getting involved, please let us know. Happy to have more folks get involved with that effort. So please join me in thanking Dr. Greer for a great conversation, filling us all in. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.